Today on Heroes of Improv, we're going to be talking with two trans queer improvisers and teachers, and the subject of what we're going to be doing is really how to portray gender, how to portray queer characters, particularly in theatrical or dramatic improv. Here with us, I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Davidson. Stephen is the artistic director of the improvised play, Improvable, Queer Improv, a gender-swapped film noir fantasy. He also teaches classes on improvisation, various aspects of improvisation, including playing gender and portraying queer characters. And he has written 2 books, which are Improvising Gender and Improvising Queer Characters. Mara Joy is also an improv teacher and performer. She is based in Edinburgh, Scotland, and she's a member of the Scottish Comedy Award-winning Spontaneous Players and performs in the 2-person show, Me Plus One. They also do workshops together. I am delighted to say that I took one of their workshops on improvising queer characters. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to throw out there immediately, what are your ideas about how people can respectfully and authentically represent gender, represent queer characters in theatrical or improv, or also spontaneous improv, or improvising full-length plays, however you describe it?
It's a big question, and I feel like Mara and I both sort of did that pause of, I know I have lots to say, why don't you go first? I think we both had that same thing.
Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, the first question is whether or not you should. I feel like there are some situations where if you play, I think particularly a trans character, it might read as the joke of a scene, depending on where you're playing and what style you're playing with, who's in the room, all of that. But I think if you are going to do it, just having a little bit of knowledge to back that up really helps. Knowing a bit about the culture. For example, I feel like it's become quite common for actors of the same gender to just play a couple as they would with anyone else. But I feel like that's slightly different from consciously deciding to be a gay character in the scene, just because if you've consciously decided that you're gay or lesbian, there's different cultural references, there's little cues, there's what's the word?
Different experiences.
Tropes? Yeah. There's all kinds of little things that sort of happen for those people who are us, which is a weird way of phrasing that.
Those people, us.
The people, us.
Yeah. But yeah, I 100% agree. Like, the biggest thing, and Stephen mentioned it already for me, is being curious enough to seek out knowledge on some, like, if you're wanting to portray a queer identity that you have no idea about, right? That is not who you are, is not how you identify, then I think the bare minimum requirement should be to find out something about it, to explore that, to have an idea of what you're doing, instead of just going, well, I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out on stage and guess. It seems like a recipe to find yourself in a situation where you trip up and make some, mistakes that could be like offensive to some people, or damaging, or just not good improv. So, yeah. So when it comes
give me an example of the types of things that somebody could do wrong, right, or that you've seen people do wrong as they portray these kind of characters.
Wow, it's got so many.
Well,
it's more common. I see it more commonly when it comes to sort of trans identities and stuff. I see it much more commonly in scripted stuff where you can always tell. This is Stephen and I have talked about this before. You can always tell if a scene was in any was written by a straight or cisgender writer versus whether it was written by a queer writer, because sometimes they'll just say like a certain term, like they'll go or a certain way of like relating an experience. I'm like, this doesn't feel authentic, right? It's so somebody saying something like I've seen like things before with trans people going, you don't understand, my trans identity is this, and I'm like, that's not really how I would say that. Like that, it's very clinical. Like you've read it out of a book and just decided that's how I speak. And I'm like, which it is not. Yeah.
So I feel like some other things that I see done wrong are focusing on medical stuff, which I just, not just for trans characters, I don't want to see that in most improv shows, TBH, but like stuff about surgeries and what's in your pants, I'm not interested. Using a character's or person's dead name, so the name they had before transition, is usually a bit of a taboo. It's quite personal information for a lot of us. And I think something that is very difficult to navigate is showing trans characters, or I think any character whose identity is marginalized, in a sort of state of trauma, you know, all of the difficult things about that identity. That is extra hard to play if it's not you. And you probably shouldn't unless you've put a decent amount of time and effort and you are surrounded by people of that identity who think it's cool you're doing that. I would much rather see trans, non-binary, and queer characters who are in a close relationship rather than at the doctor's, surrounded by chosen family rather than being rejected by their biological family, and in a state of joy about their identity rather than it being a crushing weight they're trying to deal with, you know?
There's a tendency to focus on gender dysphoria rather than gender euphoria, which is the other side of gender dysphoria. In relation to the dead naming thing, that's a prime example that I was trying to think of an example. The amount of times I've seen a scene, either improvised or scripted, where someone's like, and a revelation scene that's like, you don't understand, my name used to be Greg. And I'm like, I've never met any trans person who's ever volunteered their dead name to me, ever. It's not a thing that we do. But it's such this sort of shorthand for theatricality to go, you don't understand, I used to be this. And it's like, nobody speaks like that. Nobody says that. It rings hollow. And so those are like just things that ring hollow, right?
In general, I think I'm not interested in the Oscar-winning moment for that queer character. Like, I just want to see them getting a coffee with their friend most of the time.
Yes, please.
One of my friends suggested that if one were playing a trans character, and this friend, by the way, is a gay man, but not trans, but is an improviser. They were saying that showing them, for instance, trying to figure out makeup or something, because a lot of people go male to female, later in life, and most people who are biologically female learn those makeup techniques, as adolescents. They learn that. He was suggesting that something like that, or having difficulty finding shoes that fit, because one's feet are bigger than, for some trans, are bigger than most women's. That could be a way of doing it, but what do you all think?
I understand that and I say that is coming from a better and more sort of helpful place than the trauma that Stephen was talking about. But it's also, it feels weirdly trivializing in some ways, and I know this is I don't mean no disrespect to your friend at all, but a passing reference, sure, like I don't wear makeup regularly because I don't want to, and B, I don't have the historical not yet for the reasons you explained. But if so, it would be kind of weird to me if somebody made that a big thing in a scene just because it's not. But there is people I know who, like trans people I know who do talk and think about makeup a lot, although they tend to be very, very good at it. A lot of the trans people I know are incredible at makeup because for many reasons. I also the one that really got me there was the thing about feet and stuff. Jokes, or not jokes, references that sort of are light-hearted references at the expense of things that cause gender dysphoria, like having the wrong size feet or the wrong size hands or that kind of thing. I would probably avoid unless you really know where you're coming from and really know what you're talking about, because it can feel a bit not mocking, but just like pointing out the differences, which is there is obviously differences. Like that's one of the things we do want to talk about is that, like as Stephen mentioned before, having two actors of the same gender playing a couple is different to having two actors of the same gender deciding to play a gay couple. But it's about finding a positive way of looking at that difference rather than going, well, I can't find shoes anymore. What? Like, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Anecdotally, also, I have giant feet, and I will bet you anything Mara really does not, because I'm twice as wide.
I've got reasonably wide feet, but I have very small hands.
I have seen those hands.
We were talking about this the other day, yeah.
I feel like a really interesting way into an identity-based character can be point of view and sort of emotional skill set, if that makes sense. So, for example, bodily autonomy is really important to trans folk because there's a lot of medical gatekeeping, and we really just want to be able to do what we like with our own selves. So maybe rather than talking about, I don't know, surgeries and stuff like that, you just take that as a point of view, and maybe in that scene, you let your kid get a tattoo. Maybe you're the one parent who's cool with that because you just think, well, it's your arm, do what you want. Or, for example, the idea of chosen family is really important. So I think a lot of queer folk, but trans people in general, because with a lot of other identities, most of the time, someone else in your family holds that. But for queer people, we're often the only one. So for us, community is something that we have to go out and find if we want to be with other people like us. I think that idea of a really close bond with a friend group is a really nice thing to bring into a scene as a point of view. Little things like that, I feel, are a good starting point. Or, for example, feminism. We all know how much better men are treated because we've seen it from both sides. So maybe your character is a real outspoken feminist, and that's why. Yeah.
So to tie that back into the sort of the thing that your friend was suggesting, like instead of it being so, if the truth of this character is that they do sort of struggle with makeup because they've not grown up in that, maybe their point of view is they're a bit more forgiving of people's like appearances or people's looks because they're like, look, we don't know what's going on in their life, we don't know where they were, that kind of thing. So it's instead of the thing being, here's this thing about me, it's here's how this thing has affected me, how this experience has changed me as a person. So it's I think that like I say, I think that's 100% the right style of the right mindset to go in with, right? Rather than making it about big, deep, dramatic things, like make it about how that experience has shaped who you are as a person. And I think, that's always going to be more satisfying.
And that's interesting because I wonder if maybe transgender women are more forgiving of women's fashion choices, makeup choices, because they haven't grown up and had themselves be regarded that
Well,
way all the time. I mean, I can just
it's
remember all the things I, as a biological woman, was told by my mother. And so I'm always looking at other women and checking their makeup,
yeah.
checking their fashion, things like that. And
I think it varies wildly from like there. It could go either way. Either it goes that way of like, oh, you're more forgiving, or whatever. You're more like, look, we're all just figuring stuff out. Although I do know a lot of trans women who are very specific about fashion and very fashionable and like very have sometimes are really mean about it. Like, and that can happen too because they, of anything, trans women are policed even more than cis women on that thing. Like, if you're not if you don't look women enough, and huge inverted commas, then you don't pass, and if you don't pass, you don't fit in, and etc. So it becomes this whole. I mean, it's the same misogyny, right? Just applied to different people. And that ties into what Stephen was saying about how most trans people are very strongly feminist, but sometimes that can become there's a lot of internalized misogyny that comes with that, or a lot of internalized transphobia that comes with that, and that's complicated stuff. And I would love to see an improvised show which dealt with some of that kind of issues, but I feel like that would take a lot of research and a lot of knowledge to get to that point, because see, something as simple as like, oh, this makeup thing is actually indicative of a huge issue for trans people and queer people in general, like of difference and looking a certain way, and that can become and depending on how you approach that can be a fun, lighthearted, like, this is a character trait, or it can be, this is a defining part of this character. And I think both are very interesting and different ways of looking at it, but one requires a lot deeper understanding. Yeah.
I know that when I took your workshop, I think both of you were saying that you would prefer not to always be put into the transgender role in improv, that you want to be able to play other things. Can you say more about that?
I quite like playing trans characters,
Oh,
but I do sometimes feel that if I don't, no one else in the room is going to, and then
Yeah.
we lose the representation of that identity. And I think that's a bigger problem broadly in improv, is that we tend to sort of default to the identity of the majority. It's rare for straight people to really consciously and deliberately choose to play even gay characters, let alone trans characters. And likely, if you've come from a different country and joined the group, you're probably playing scenes in the culture of that majority rather than them playing scenes about your country, which is a shame, because I think if you have a lovely, diverse group of people to begin with, why not learn about each other and sort of expand that base of what you can play and where you can play? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And also, similarly, I talked about this in the class that we were teaching on Thursday, actually. Stephen has on his website, it's impromiscuous.com, am I correct? Is that correct? Cool. Yes. Has a series of interviews with trans improvisers, which is a great place to start if you want to know if you want to hear more about this and stuff. And one of the questions that Stephen asks everybody in that is, how often do you play trans characters or see other people play trans characters? And the answers are very usually not at all. Like, I don't play trans characters that often, which doesn't make much sense, because why not? Like, a lot of the time it's because I'm playing in narrative improv shows that are based on existing properties, so those characters aren't traditionally shown as trans, but they can be. It's improv. We can do whatever we want. But even when it comes, even for myself, I have that fear, and I think that's something we should probably touch on here. I have that fear that I will say or do something wrong or offensive, or I'll suck the air out of the room. You know, that moment when somebody says something on stage and everyone in the room is just like, oh, is this what we're doing now? Ooh. Even if that is a positive thing, it can still be like, I came here to see a show, I didn't know we were going to be talking about this or looking at this, I didn't want to have to think about the world. I have that fear about portraying my own identity on stage, which is just a whole... That's one of the reasons we decided to run this course that we were running, is the more normalized it becomes for anyone to like sort of like, hey, I'm going to respectfully and carefully and thoughtfully play this kind of character, the easier it will be for anyone to do that in future, if that makes sense. The more representation there is of something, the less responsibility there is for every time you're that representation for it to be perfect, right? That's just how representation works. So yeah, I would love to not be the only person in the room even trying to play a trans character. That'd be fantastic. I would love that. If I did a show where every single person I was playing with was cis, but playing trans characters, and I played the only cisgender character in that show, that would blow my mind, and I would love it.
I'm picturing that show. You're playing board games. It's cute.
That's all I'm doing. Yeah, that's literally. I mean, that's what I do with all of my queer friends. So.
I'm wondering if it's possible for somebody to be playing a transgender character without ever mentioning they're playing a transgender character. I know one of my transgender friends, who is a transgender woman, recently put on Facebook how a couple of incidents of being harassed by men. And this is a transgender woman who is an absolutely beautiful woman who I don't think the men realize that she's transgender. And when I looked at what she described, and she only transitioned about 2 years ago, and she's maybe 32. So, you know, this is a fairly new process for her. To me, what she experienced was pretty normal for any woman. Yeah. I mean, she was walking, I think, to her apartment's laundry room or something, and there were men in the hallway, and she, you know, got in between them, you know, so excuse me, gets in between them. One asked for her telephone number, another is commenting on her good looks, and I know my comment was, I'm really sorry that, you know, this upset you. I want you to know that as someone who has a lot of, you know, background with this, I always was really careful, first of all, with using my apartment's laundry room, because a lot of women get raped there, and in laundry rooms. And the other thing is that when I see, you know, men clustered together like that, if I can't go another way around them, I sort of expect, I'm steeled for some kind of comment that I don't want. You know, that this is not something that just happened to happen to you. This is sort of the universal experience of being a woman, and this is how to protect yourself. You know? Yeah,
there's a common refrain that is used. We talked about this on Thursday actually, which is used usually with good intentions, where like somebody will talk about like a trans woman will be like, oh yeah, I got wolf whistled or harassed in the street or whatever, and somebody will inevitably say, ah yeah, I know, welcome to womanhood, right? And it's like, it's meant in a nice like, hey, welcome to the club kind of way, but it's always put with that side of the, you know, welcome to misogyny, welcome to living in a patriarchal society, rather than oh yeah, I dressed up nicely, went to the club and had a good time with my friends, and nobody ever goes, yeah, welcome to womanhood for that, right? It's always the other thing. But 100%, like, that's a huge thing that I think some people don't think about until it's like brought up like that, is that trans women are women and therefore are subject to misogyny. That's just a fact. So whether we are, I say they and we are clocked as being trans or not, that misogyny, like the reality of living in the world in a certain gender, it will be slightly different because of your experiences growing up, like because of your experiences and your like the way that you have learned coping mechanisms or behavioral coping mechanisms, but essentially it's the same stuff, right? Like,
Yeah.
Stephen, I know, has talked about being. I'm not to speak for you, but I know you've mentioned before about after transitioning, people paying more attention to you in an authority position, like just almost overnight.
Yeah,
That,
I grew a beard and people started just assuming I was in charge. And likewise with feeling unsafe, I used to feel really unsafe with stuff like being catcalled or walking alone at night. And genuinely, on the rare occasion people catcall me now, I go, "Ooh, thank you," and I take it as a compliment, like men say you should. But I can take it as a compliment because I'm not threatened because I know they're not going to come suck me up, right?
Yeah.
And that's the difference in the world that we inhabit in different genders.
and that's something that I think sometimes gets missed in the when people talk about like performance of a trans character, right? I can't remember where it was. I think it was an episode of. There's a trans character in Jessica Jones, the Marvel Netflix show, and it's never mentioned that she's trans, but she's played by a trans actor, and is like, and as far as the actor is concerned, she's like, yeah, that character was trans. Similarly, in the TV show Shrill, which has Patty Harrison, who's one of my favourite human beings in the entire world, who's a trans comedian and actor, like, she's playing a character in it who, again, she's pretty sure that, like, she's like, I'm pretty sure that character's trans, and it's never mentioned because it doesn't, there's so much more going on with that character than the fact that she's trans. And then like just playing the one of the big things that I think is so important, and we talk about this a lot in the course, is play the person rather than the identity. Right, the person is obviously influenced by the identity they have, but it's not the be all and end all of a person. Like, it's not like, well, it's not like you have these deep 3-dimensional characters, and then then there's a gay character, so we don't need to worry about them. Their character trait is gay. This person's character trait is trans. Like, we should still be trying to play in the like deep 3-dimensional characters because that's just better performance, right? So yeah, and I think that's something that's sometimes missed, and that's like that's why there's a difference between doing it in like a dramatic improv scene or a narrative improv thing where you've got a lot of time and a lot of space where you can explore what that means, versus like a short form improv game where you're trying to get through the alphabet. It's like, well, we don't have time to explore this very complicated set of circumstances. So yeah, so probably that's that. Although you still could, I could play an alphabet game where I was trans and it never comes up. That's fine.
The last time I made a character that I was playing in a scene trans, that character had come up to a female character at a bus stop and was making conversation, and like in a really lighthearted way, but she was visibly uncomfortable. So I outed my own character as trans, and she was visibly relaxed. And then we carried on the scene, and I was like, "Oh yeah, great. There, good tool." It wasn't
and that
emphatic.
seems
Yeah,
very authentic. Both of the characters, and they're very authentic. As a strange man talking to me, I would be like, "Are you going to try to drag me away and kill me?" But if I knew that he had been a woman, that would be such a relief.
oh yeah, I see why you're uncomfortable. This used to happen to me too. Like,
Yeah.
I just
Just
saw
like,
that book and I read that book and I wanted to talk to you about it.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And
Equally,
I could see that kind of scene like in a long type of drama like we're trying to do in Duluth.
Yeah.
That could be the beginning of somebody's friendship.
Of course.
Know?
And as equally, I've been in fun scenes, and actually like in shows and in real life where I've been sort of like, I'll be like, somebody will be approaching and I'm like, oh, I don't know if this person's like, oh, like, because there's a sad fact of being queer in any space is that you can never be 100% sure what somebody is going to think when they meet you, because you can't control what other people think, etc., etc. But like, there's a specific type of like queer woman who, it's, to me it feels like 70-30 on whether they're going to be really happy to see me and really excited to see me, or really upset to see me and really angry to see me. And I don't know until there's an interaction, and that's always an interesting thing where I'm like going, hey, and then someone goes, hey, how are you doing? And I'm like, oh, great, yeah, like this is versus someone going, hey, and I'm like, oh, and that's true of like just people anywhere in the world. Like that's that's a really interesting thing to play, and I would recommend erring on the side of playing the positive part of that, because otherwise you're going to have to play transphobes and homophobes, and that doesn't feel like a fun character choice.
No.
I talk about this a bunch. There's the TV show Schitt's Creek. There's a fantastic thing in that I just think that which has influenced how I've been approaching the idea of putting queer characters in improv shows, where like one of the main characters in that is pansexual. Like that's his whole thing. There's a whole bit about how he doesn't care about whether it's red wine or white wine. He doesn't care about like what's in it. He cares about the label. Like he doesn't like that kind of. I've messed it up. It's a very beautiful speech. You should find it. But and he has a same-sex relationship that is really central to the show. And he was talking to one of the co-stars, because Dan Levy, who writes it, is a gay man, and he writes the show, and he wrote that character for himself and that relationship for himself. And he was talking to Emily Hampshire, who's one of his co-stars, and she was like, don't you feel like you have a responsibility to like show like some sort of elements of homophobia, and then it being like shut down and everyone like thing? And he's like, and his response was, I see enough homophobia in my life, my day-to-day life, in real life. Why would I write it into this fictional world that I'm creating? I have a chance to write a world where homophobia doesn't exist. That's what I'm going to write. That's what I want to see. Like, and it blew her mind. She was like, oh yeah. It's like, he's like, I don't, like, that story has been told over and over and over again, and it's been told really well. Don't get me wrong. Like, there are some incredible works of fiction that deal with like homophobia and deal with transphobia, and like, but I've seen them. I want to see the places where it's celebrated, where it's
normalized.
Normalized, yeah, and where the drama isn't because of them being trans or them being gay or them being bisexual or whatever. It's influenced by but not caused by that. That's what I would love to see.
So the recognition that one's life as a queer person is not filled with trauma and pain every single day. There's much more to it. There are friendships, there are romances, there are the usual problems that people have with their jobs or their partners or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anything that we have not touched on in this conversation that you think is important and want others to learn from?
Wow. I mean, there's a lot.
I think vocabulary and having the muscle memory of trying are important. So, not to plug my own website, but go look through all the interviews, because one of the things that I asked is, what are some great examples of trans characters? And across all the people who answered, there's fluffy sitcoms, and there's hard-hitting movies, and there's comic books and anime and cartoons, and whatever you're into, there are examples of it somewhere in those lists. And just sort of let it be part of your vocabulary. Watch some fun TV shows. You don't necessarily need to go check out a textbook about gender theory. I mean, do if you want to, but I think just letting trans people and queer people be more part of your cloud of ideas in everyday life goes a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Set aside some time and try those characters. See what happens.
Yeah,
The world
like
probably won't end.
a huge recommendation I have is like follow queer people on like Instagram or on Twitter or on TikTok. Right, I am too old to be on TikTok, but I have learned so much about the queer community from being on TikTok. Like people, like there's a younger generation who have grown up learning all this stuff and are like, hey, here's an easy way to explain it. Here's a way to get into it, and that's been super helpful to me. And I'm like, wow, you're like 19 and you know more about this world than I do. That's really impressive. But equally, like, a big part of the learning is understanding that you're not going to get it right all of the time. Like, it's impossible. I don't. I'm trans and I sometimes say things that are transphobic. Like, that's like not deliberately, but like language changes, ideas change, the way that the conversation changes, the way that we speak about queer identities. Even the word queer is a contentious word that we've been using very like liberally because that's the word that fits best for me. It's the word that feels very helpful to me to discuss as the community as an umbrella term. But there are going to be you will meet people who will be like, I don't like you using that word, and a good rule of thumb is if somebody tells you, I don't like this word, I don't like you calling me this thing, don't. But be willing to know that that's that individual, and this group will be different, and there's no one right answer. Queer culture is not a monolith. It's not. We don't have a huge meeting every year and decide on the talking points for like people. We disagree on a lot of things, and being willing to look into these discussions and like occasionally ask a question that you think might be a stupid question, as long as you're asking it in good faith. Usually people will be like, if they've got the time, space and energy, they will give you a decent answer. Equally, don't expect everyone to always 100% be willing to justify their identity to you at any given moment, because that's exhausting. But it's I don't know, it's trial and error and putting in like the time and effort to sort of just read, watch, listen.
I assume too that getting to know queer and trans people would be important because
Absolutely.
apparently a lot of people think they don't have friends who fit in those categories. They probably do, but they don't realize it.
I had a friend who once was sitting in a room. This was before I transitioned, actually, but they were talking, or before I was out, and they were talking about how they didn't know any queer people, and I was sitting there going, "This is an awkward position because I am, but don't want to talk about this right now." But then one of my other friends went, "I'm bisexual. I'm married to a man, but I am bisexual. You've just assumed that I'm not. But it's like you're good friends with a queer person." And this person was like, "Oh, okay." So like, until having that conversation, they weren't able to have that conversation, And like, I don't say that to like shame my friend to be like, "Oh, no. He was an idiot for thinking that." Well, it's because he was just like, "Oh, I just didn't realize," and that, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then they were able to discuss what that meant, and he's better informed now, and that's a win on everyone's part.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being willing to discuss this topic and enlighten a lot of people, educate a lot of people. I want to remind everybody that Stephen has a website called impromiscuous.com, and there's a lot of resources on there. Mara Jo, Joy, is there any other a resource that you would suggest?
Oh man, there's so many. I don't know. Watch Pose, I guess. It's great. find me on the internet. I retweet a lot of people. I'm at Mara Joy Loves everywhere. So
Okay, Mara Joy Love is what your Twitter handle is?
yeah, and
Great.
my Instagram and everything else. So
Okay, well, thank you so much, and looking forward to continuing to know you and play with you.
Thanks for having us.